Hello, everyone. My name is Esther Wagner. I am the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute. Thank you very much for joining us again at this webinar series that is run jointly by the Wolf Institute and the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. We also have a lot of partners, CSIC, IMF, the University of Munich, the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln, Ghent University, and I know I always forget someone, so I hope that Antonella, in the end, if you can have
Exeter and Edinburgh, yes.
Exeter and Edinburgh, these are the two I always forget. So Exeter and Edinburgh are also partners in this. And we're actually nearing the 5th anniversary this year, so very soon we'll have our 5 years cycle of these lectures in the bag. So please stay tuned and keep on coming to these webinars. This is our first webinar in 2025. And many of you are very familiar with how we run these webinars, but for those who are joining us for the first time, the Wolf Institute is a research institute in Cambridge, which focuses on religion and society, and we combine our research with policy work and with public engagement. If you are interested, please look at our website and our YouTube channel to learn more about our work. And now with my other hat on, the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean was founded in 1997. It's dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of cross-cultural Mediterranean history from the 5th to the 15th centuries. This is the moment that we always introduce our journal, the Journal of the Society. I hope I can I have this blurring function. Oh yeah, there's a sweet spot where I can get it, I think. Okay, this is the green cover of our journal, which comes as part of the subscription of the Society. So please consider joining the Society. It's a very, very modest annual fee, which comes with a lot of benefits, including these very, very thick volumes of Al-Masak. A very quick introduction also of how the webinar works. We have a Zoom webinar audience. We're also live streaming via Facebook. So if you want to rewatch this or if you want to recommend it to anyone, you can direct them to the Society or the Wolf Institute Facebook pages and also to the Wolf Institute YouTube channel where it will appear shortly. The theme for today is the medieval Mediterranean, fields of convergence, rural communities in late medieval Italy and Yemen. So we have a very, very interesting comparative hour ahead of us. And our chair is the Emeritus Society President and also former Editor-in-Chief of Al-Masak of the journal, who will introduce our speakers very shortly. After you hear the presentations, you can type any questions you have in our Q&A portal, which is at the bottom of the screen. It's much easier for the chair to handle the questions if they're in the Q&A, so it doesn't have to check both the chat and the Q&A box. So please type them in the Q&A portal. We will stop the recording, the video recording at 6 o'clock, but you are cordially invited to stay afterwards when we have a bit of a more informal chat after the time. So now is the time to hand over to the chair. Jo, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Miriam, for introducing this seminar, which as Miriam already suggested, will be dedicated to the rural histories and historiographies of the medieval Mediterranean. So my name is Jo van Steenbergen, and I teach pre-modern Islamic history at Ghent University in Belgium. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you, and I will do so in some more detail later after my introduction, our panelists of today, Dr. Davide Cristoferi, who's related to the Free University of Brussels, ULB, and also to Ghent University, and Dr. Zachary Monshtari de Pierrepont, who's a postdoc at Ghent University. First, a word of thanks to Zachary, who actually put this panel together, to both Davide and Zachary for accepting to participate in it, and of course also a big thank you to the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean for hosting this panel, and to our own Henri Pirenne Institute for Medieval Studies at Ghent University, who have been supporting and helping us with the organization. As Miriam suggested, indeed, as just briefly announced, this panel examines rural communities in late medieval Latin Christianity and Islamic Middle East through a comparative lens. We will be focusing especially on case studies in Italy and Yemen in the late medieval period. Comparative issues and questions will be dealt with mostly in the Q&A that will follow. Now, recent scholarship has significantly advanced our understanding of rural societies in the Latin West and Islamic Middle East, challenging traditional narratives, revealing more complex socio-political and socio-economic practices and structures. These advances and opportunities in recent scholarship that have also been achieved by our panelists are among the direct reasons for the organization of this panel today. And they include the postdoctoral research project that Zachary started pursuing last autumn at Ghent University, entitled Yemen Rural Communities and Tribes, Society, Economy and Power between the 13th and the 15th centuries. And Zachary will explain all about this later on. But this project certainly has also been inspired by recent work, such as by Élise Voguet, senior researcher at the CNRS, on the rural history of the Maghreb and the Sahara Desert region, as well as of rural communities of the Jebel Lubnan in Lebanon, all in the late medieval period, all highlighting the agency of peasants, the complexity of local power structures. And then there's certainly also the work of Yossef Rapoport, professor of Islamic history at Queen Mary University in London. He works on the rural history of the medieval Eastern Mediterranean. And especially worth mentioning here is his forthcoming monograph entitled Becoming Arab, the Formation of Arab Identity in the Medieval Middle East, in which Dr. Rapoport uses extensive documentary and literary, administrative and material evidence to reflect very critically on the strong connections between the formation of Arab village clans, mass conversion to Islam, and new landholding regimes in medieval Egypt and Greater Syria. But other reasons certainly also include the research that Davide is pursuing, including at the Free University in Brussels and at Ghent University, related to the topics of livestock farming practices, resource sustainability and animal biology, the logic of agrarian contracts and institutional economics, and the perception, conceptualization, and representation of socioeconomic inequalities, all with a particular focus on Tuscany in Italy. Again, this research is inspired by, or certainly happens also in collaboration with the work of my colleague Thijs Lambrecht at Ghent University. He teaches economic and rural history at Ghent University in Belgium. He's published extensively on long-term processes of social, economic, and ecological change, especially in the Low Countries. So there's many good reasons and a lot of things happening in rural history to organize this session on rural history today, as we will certainly also hear from our two speakers. The talks by Davide and Zachary will introduce you into the current state of their respective fields, Italy and Yemen, highlight recent shifts, present new frameworks that are emerging. After this introduction, I will hand over first to Davide and then to Zachary for both their talks, which will focus on the case studies of Southern Italy and Rasulit, Yemen. I will introduce both speakers separately just before their talk, beginning with Davide. Then I will open the Q&A with one or two comparative questions that I will ask myself, and then open the floor for any questions from the audience. And as Miriam earlier already explained, I would be very much obliged if you could use the Q&A chat at the bottom of the screen to write your questions, which I will then read out to the panelists. So our first speaker, Davide Cristoferi, holds a PhD in medieval history from the University of Siena in Italy. Since 2015, his postdoctoral projects have taken him to the University of Ghent, to Bocconi University in Milan, where he held a visiting fellowship at the Carlo Dondena Center for Research on Social Dynamics and Public Policies, and since October 2023, to the Free University of Brussels, the ULB, where he's been a research fellow of the FNRS. Davide is currently working on a second interdisciplinary PhD in economic and social history and economics at Ghent University. His research focuses on the economic and social history of rural Western Europe between the late Middle Ages and the early modern periods, on which he has published extensively in English, Italian, and French. His main themes of research, and I already introduced some topics earlier, concern the relationship between town and countryside, economic inequalities, and human-environment interactions in the 14th and 15th century, and the links between history, geography, landscape archaeology, and economic theory. Davide's paper is entitled Inequality, Conflicts and Hierarchies During the Crisis of the Late Middle Ages to Rural Communities in Southern Tuscany, circa 1350, circa 1450. It will focus on the evolution of the social and economic structure of the rural communities of southern Tuscany in the context of the so-called crisis of the late Middle Ages, exacerbated by the Black Death of the mid-14th century and lasting until the first half of the 15th century. Davide, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for this kind work and for inviting me to this seminar. I'm just sharing my screen in order to start with the presentation. So here am I. I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this seminar. And today, as has just been said, I will focus on a specific aspect of my research, which is inequality, conflicts, and hierarchies during the crisis of the late Middle Ages, focusing on the rural communities in southern Tuscany. This talk wants to briefly present the complex interplay between socio-economic inequality, horizontal and vertical conflicts over access to resources, and the emergence of social and settlement hierarchies in a period characterized by profound economic and demographic changes. By situating this regional analysis within a broader context, as is the goal of this seminar, this case study could provide material for further comparisons in order to identify common trends and divergences across the Mediterranean, not only in dynamics but also in sources and literature. So, first I will focus on the context and the sources of my case studies. The late Middle Ages, as is known, was a critical period of transformation in both the Mediterranean and Europe. Traditionally framed as a period of crisis, recent scholarship has nuanced this narrative, starting with the study of the Western Mediterranean, for instance. Terms such as conjoncture, transformation, transition, and even development now offer a more dynamic perspective. Scholars such as, for instance, Alfani, have highlighted changing trend in wealth distribution as a key element of this transformation, shifting and redefining the focus from previous emphasis on the proletarianization of the peasantry to inequality within rural communities and between them and urban society. This was the result of demographic trends, economic transformation, and institutions, since the debate is still open on the causes, institutions such as the tax system or marriage and inheritance systems and patterns. And also, we should take into account the economic and political influence of market elites, as recently highlighted by Van Bavel. Besides, and more recently a new attention to the role of seigneurial lords as key economic actors in this transition and of the agency of peasants as well is emerging. This research builds on these findings by examining southern Tuscany, an apparently marginal region characterized anyway by a strong integration into urban markets, the presence of large and small seigneuries, and its vulnerability to external pressures, including military expansion and demographic collapse. In this respect, as we will see in the next slides, the recent shift in interpretation and focus from crisis to conjuncture and from rural communities perceived as passive subjects to the assertion of their agency does not always apply here, although we will try to show some nuances while more research is still needed. To understand the dynamics at play, and we can see here the region of a case study, we need to examine the socioeconomic and political landscape of southern Tuscany. Covering about a third of the Tuscan territory, the population density of the region in 1450, that is, after the crisis, was between 6 and 7 inhabitants per square kilometer. Before 1350, it was probably a little higher, but not too much. Two relatively small urban centers, Massa Marittima and Grosseto, have a population varying between 1,400 and 10,000 people. Most of the population, however, lived in concentrated settlement of a few hundred people exploiting the common land around them. The rural economy was deeply integrated with regional urban markets, particularly relevant in northern Tuscany. Florence and Pisa, for instance, among the most famous cities, providing goods such as grain, minerals, timber, and charcoal. Transhumance, the seasonal movement of livestock and from the Apennines and from the mountains to the coast, and extensive cereal cultivation were particularly important. But this integration came at a price. Siena, a major political and economic player from 1300 onwards, in competition with other cities such as Pisa and Orvieto, exerted considerable influence through military expansion, resource extraction, and taxation policies, often at the expenses of local communities. Even more, South Tuscany was particularly struck by the so-called late medieval crisis. From 1300 to 1425, the region experienced an increasing number of adverse events. Epidemics, famines, wars, and mercenary raids became regular occurrences, increasing to more than one per year from 1348, the year of the Black Death. In Tuscany. The Black Death, in particular, caused a general demographic collapse in the area and weakened the financial and military capacity of the signories. Siena's economy adapted to the new context, however, with a specific strategy. Through the uses of indirect taxes, pasture exploitation, and strategic investment in secure assets such as land and, to some extent, textiles, Siena was able to survive the crisis, but, as we will see, at the expenses of its territories. Finally, before presenting my findings, I would like to comment on the sources I've used. This study is based on exceptional wealth of archival material, mainly from the state archives of Siena, including, among the many examples, the deliberation of the city council and of the government of Siena, containing policies, petitions from the rural communities, and court records from the 13th to the 18th century. Between parentheses, you can see the sources that I've used among the many registers available. Budget reviews, another example of the public offices, a unique sources that provide an overview of policies and public investment in the territory. Also, acts of submission of the rural communities containing their rights and duties established by Siena and the regulation of access to the commons and the taxes to be paid. And finally, the statutes of the rural communities, which give an insight into local government and the management of the collective properties and common pool resources such as pastures, land, and woods, which were particularly important in that region. This source provides a window into the interaction between rural communities with urban elites and the city-state of Siena. It should be remembered, in fact, anyway, that almost all these sources were produced by the dominant city, while only local statutes give us an indication of the voice of the rural communities, and that even these statutes were rewritten after the Sienese conquest by Sienese notaries and approved by the Sienese city councils. The mediation of the urban authority is also evident in the transcription of a petition of the rural communities, although they can also give us an idea of the internal problems and life of these settlements. One of the defining features of this period of transformation, and the key that I have used to examine the sources mentioned above, was the growing inequality of access to resources between the state, communities, Sienese investors, and local inhabitants. This inequality, as we shall see, was the result both of a conjuncture of the 14th century, fueled by the demographic and military crisis in this region, and of the policies adopted by Siena to deal with these problems. In this context, the rural population also acted, trying above all to adapt to the new economic and institutional framework, resisting change when possible or migrating when impossible. Moreover, the demographic and consumption changes that follow the Black Death stimulated both supply and demand for food and materials, making the already well-established pastoralism in southern Tuscany even more profitable than before. In this respect, a specific institution for the management of transhumance became the channel for most of the changes and adaptation that developed there during this period, also involving rural communities. And here is the first dynamics I'm just describing. This institution was created 5 years after the Black Death as a public office for pastures in order to exploit the depopulated areas of southern Tuscany for financial gain. Basically, the office leased most of the collective and private pastures to transhumant shepherds and cattle owners in exchange for tax revenue each winter. As early as 1366, the office was recalled as Dogana, which is very important because this name has actually Persian origin from Duvan, which actually was translated in vernacular in Italian as monopoly, especially in Siena. So Dogana has this specific means, even if the original meaning in Arab or Persian was just public office. Indeed, the Dogana soon became a powerful institution and by 1419, when its statutes were approved, it controlled most of the grazing rights in southern Tuscany, previously acquired by Siena through military conquest and expropriation. The Sienese public archival records linked to the Dogana provide most of the evidence on this development, recording most of the transhumant flocks from the entire region and beyond. In 1417, there were around 90,000 sheep recorded, rising to 350,000 more than a century later. Financially, the Dogana generated significant revenues. Between 1361 and 1417, its net income totaled over 320,000 florins, underscoring its economic importance for Siena and for the regional economy. However, this monopolization of collective and private pastures was to the detriment of rural communities, whose collective grazing rights were curtailed and access rules disrupted. Transhumant shepherds, whose interests were basically aligned with those of Siena, were favored over local cereal producers and livestock owners. For instance, in 1366, the Sienese city council established the primacy of foreign, that is, transhumant herds in the pastures of the community of Magliano over local cattle, to which the officials of the Dogana assigned limits and time, I'm just quoting, of grazing. Siena's strategy of consolidating control over rural resources extended to the systematic expropriation of common land. This was achieved, as I said before, through military conquest, the renegotiation of acts of submission, and direct purchases from local lords. The monopoly of the Dogana prioritized transhumance over local agricultural activities, forcing communities and landowners to lease their pastures to Siena. In 1367, for example, Siena set up a commission to determine whether the pastures in the district of Montepescali, a community, belonged to that community or to Siena. But more importantly, Siena already established before the trial was concluded that if the assets and rights were found to belong to the community, this community was obliged to sell them to the Dogana every year at a price set by Siena. The combined effects of the Dogana and the expropriation of the commons reshaped rural communities deeply in southern Tuscany. The impact was profound. Local cereal production declined as pasture expanded, also as a result of a demographic collapse. But indeed, the development of transhumance, that's my point, did not help in this regard. And the declining rural population faced rising costs to access previously common land. Many small cattle owners, farmers, and pastoralists became wage-earning shepherds or leaseholders of herds owned by Sienese investors, as they claimed in their petition and as official reports from the 16th century indicate. In addition, indebtedness to Siena to pay the taxes increased the vulnerability of local rural communities, leading to a loss of autonomy and increased dependence on Sienese policies to obtain tax exemptions or access to pastures. The case of Montepescali, again, is very clear. In 1404, so 40 years after the previous trial, the inhabitants complained that the taxes they had to pay forced them to sell their grazing rights to some investors from Pisa, following the indication of the dominant city. At the same time, Siena selectively supported resilient and strategically valuable communities. These favored settlements received temporary tax exemptions, loans, and controlled access to pastures, strengthening their ties to the dominant city. This selective favoring exacerbated inequalities and created new hierarchies both within and between communities. In 1418, for example, it was the community of Bocchegiano that requested the intervention of Siena, having recently seen its boundaries shrink to the benefit of other neighboring communities, while the rest of its territory was placed under the control of the Dogana, cutting off its inhabitants from its exploitation and forcing some of them to migrate elsewhere, as they declare in the petition. In conclusion, the case of the rural communities of southern Tuscany in the late Middle Ages illustrates how the interplay between crisis and institutions can act as a catalyst for profound socio-economic transformations. In this respect, the role of the communities as passive victims has been more studied and highlighted even in this presentation, although, as the examples given suggest, there was also hierarchization, adaptation and competition between and probably within them. I will try to highlight a few points at the end. In particular, we have identified three main dynamics affecting this area and its rural population. First, a growing inequality of access to the commons provoked by this 70-year process of land grabbing by the city-state of Siena to increase the tax revenues at the expense of the territory. This inequality was mainly between the rural communities and the dominant city, favoring the transhumant shepherds and probably affecting the social and economic structures of the communities. It should also be remembered that in most cases, these communities were depopulated settlements, already affected by wars, epidemics and migration, and therefore not strong enough to resist, leaving an empty social and economic space for Siena to act. Secondly, such a high level of inequality, although difficult to calculate in a quantitative way, led to new levels of conflict and competition for access to strategic resources such as pastures and woods, which before the conquest of Siena had probably been shared, but we don't know how much equally, between the lords and the communities. In this conflict, Siena acted as the main mediator, as a state, and at the same time interested party, both as a public owner of pasture land and as a representative of the interests of Sienese cattle owners and investors. Therefore, these horizontal conflicts were biased by a vertical power which was constantly regulating the balance between the different actors. Thirdly, as mentioned above, this inequality created new hierarchies. Siena chose the more resilient and strategic communities for taxes, territorial control and grain production, thus increasing the impact of a demographic and military crisis. In addition, Sienese investors, cattle owners and Sienese political and market elites probably contributed to the creation of new local hierarchies within rural communities through share leasing, access to the commons, land ownership or land purchase, and acting in favor of a community where their interests were located. In this regard, we have some hints of these processes very clear for the end of the 15th and the 16th century, where actually part of the commons were actually sold by the state to private Sienese investors and then resold by them to some member of the local communities. Finally, I would like to conclude by stressing how much remains to be done to reconstruct and study the agency and social transformation of rural communities in southern Tuscany in the late Middle Ages. In this regard, the study of notarial register, which reveal the complex web of economic interaction between Sienese elite and members of rural community, could be critical in this regard. So I conclude and I thank you for your attention and patience.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Davide, for a great talk, a very inspiring talk. As I announced before we engage with questions for Davide, we will first have the next presentation where we shift our focus away from southern Tuscany and the increasing inequality, new conflicts and new hierarchies that emerge in the rural communities in southern Tuscany between the mid-14th and the early 15th century. We now move to the region of Yemen and to a presentation, the second presentation of this session by Zachary Moshtari de Pierrepont. Zachary holds a PhD from the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, and he specializes in the history of West Arabia, especially the history of late medieval Yemen. His expertise also covers late medieval Arabic historiography with a particular emphasis on historical writings produced in Yemen, the Hijaz, and Egypt. After having pursued postdoctoral research in Ghent and then Liège, Dr. de Pierrepont recently returned to Ghent as an FWO senior research fellow with the Yemen ARC, or Yemen ERC project, in which he examines Yemen's rural communities and tribes and their socio-economic power dynamics. Zachary's paper today is entitled Shifting Sands: Rural Transformation, Violence and Rural Elites in Late Medieval Yemen between the 13th and 15th centuries. It examines the transformation of rural communities in Yemen during the late medieval period and explores the interplay between state power, local elites and village communities, revealing a nuanced process of social and economic reconfiguration. Now, we had a bit of a technical problem, so Davide is actually going to share Zachary's presentation, and Zachary will indicate to Davide when he can move on. But Zachary, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizer. Thank you for the introduction. So I just want to say first one word, because especially after listening to David, as you're going to see, we are very much lagging in late medieval studies in terms of how we understand and how we have studied to date the rural communities. And it is the data you have are really fascinating, and we're so far from that. One of the reasons we are so far is because of, as I'm going to mention, about the nature of the sources. And this project that I'm doing about rural communities in Yemen is really a starting project, and it is in the continuity of especially Yossef Rapoport's studies on Egypt in 12th and 13th century. That studies the rural communities of the Fayoum, and who has really moved forward the field toward a better apprehension and better understanding of rural communities. And I'm very much engaged in this kind of trend, but still there are very, very few people working on rural areas, so to speak, in during this period for, like, let's say, Islamic history. So I just want to slide, please, David. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, slide again. Yeah, I just want to give a sense first of Yemeni history, but a bit of context. So Yemeni history during this period is really a major power in the Red Sea. The Rashid Sultanate is dominating Yemen between the mid 13th century to the mid 15th century. It's usually considered in historiography as like it's kind of a golden age of Yemeni history for a while, and it is indeed for a while a quite powerful player in the area. And you can see here on the left the maximum extension of the Rashid Sultanate, or at least the claim of dominion of the Rashid Sultans at the time, especially at the end of 13th century. And on the right, you can see like the core territory of the Sultanate at the time. Slide, please. Yeah. And I just want to give a feeling of what we're talking about in terms of rural spaces in Yemen. What we're talking about is mostly what you have is on the Red Sea coast, you have vast plains, fertile plains from which the Sultanates had a huge amount of revenues. It's bordering the Red Sea coast. It's very flat, very fertile, and this is just to give you a sense of this plain. And you have another part of the territory, which is slide, please, much more mountainous. And you can see that this is a completely different kind of setting in terms of spatiality and of territoriality, much more mountainous, a lot of terrace farming, and especially you have like a lot of and there's still a lot of cattle breeding. And please slide again. And so the Rashid dynasty is. The early period of the Rashid dynasty is usually associated with economic prosperity, with a loose territorial control outside some sultanic strongholds, a lot of demographic growth, and troubles. And what we see is that there is a progressive reorganization of regional elites in the 13th century, especially with much increasingly elites appear as integrating in the dawla, in the states. And what you see a lot of mention in the sources of what we call tribes or qabail or tribesmen, Arab, and which are frequently mentioned not only but often in relation to village communities. And however, the organization of village communities remain quite elusive. And I want to say here that when we hear about tribes, because Yemen is a very tribal society, it is still tribal society, but it was very much a tribal society at the time. I think here we should have a pause and just must confess that we don't really know what these tribes are. And part of my research is to investigate what a tribe in the context of Yemen during the late medieval period is. I think one of the common denominator apparently to date, I think, is that there are groups that have a capacity of organization and that often have the ability to carry weapons and to mobilize for armed conflict. And this is very much how they appear also in the corpus. So, but I must say that they are not pastoral nomads, also no Bedouin, but they can be Bedouin and they can be pastoral nomads. But when we mention tribes, we mentioned a lot of settled peasantry that grow crops in various areas. So what happens in the 14th century is that you see successive cracks in the Rasulid political order, and part of the territory is lost in the 14th century. You have a lot of tribal revolts in the mid-14th century, which means also less revenues for the state, so increasing fiscal pressure, slide please, increasing fiscal pressure on the rest of the territory controlled by the state. And so you have kind of mounting issues up to the early decades of the 15th century, where everything kind of coalesces in terms of wars, tribal revolts, the plague at Ta'un, the Black Death is really as catastrophic effects in the 15th century in Yemen. And so the state is increasingly withdrawing for more and more areas, which lead eventually to a gradual process of collapse of the Rasulid Sultanate. And you can see here the core areas that around 830s, like 1430s, common area, 1430s, the core area that the state actually controlled. So it is a very loose dominion. So what we can say about the slide, please. Thank you, David. So what we can say about how can we talk about rural communities in the corpus, how these communities are addressed in the corpus. And one of the main issues is that these communities are for the most part, a bit invisible. And so, but we still have a different kind of representation. So one of the main sources we have as fiscal records from the state, so state representation. So villages and cities are submitted to taxes, and the amount of tax that the state gets from it, mostly from the land tax, the haraj. And here you do have mentions of the fiscal administration operating in rural area, like the superintendents, the controllers, the intendants, the fortress governors. And you have a kind of vocabulary lexicon associated to people who are taxed, which is the raya, like the subject, or the people who actually pay taxes. Mentions of the emirs of the state, which people, a military commander appointed by the sultan. You have mention of the Ahl, which is like the people of large group that are identified, large family group, like the Banu Nashir. So the descendants of Nashir appear, this in this kind of fiscal records, which raise question in terms of apparently there was a kind of tax, collective tax. The tax was taken by the state collectively based on the groups and villages. And slide. And these are the administrative source representation for the state. This is one of this source, the Kitab Ratifa al-Dawla al-Mu'ayyadiyya, the book of revenues of the Sultan al-Mu'ayyad Dawood, early 14th century, which is basically a list of fiscal records, province by province of the state. So this is very interesting. I must also say that with regards to the whole of the Arab world during this area, this is kind of unique. It is very rare. There are very few material like that. And please slide. David. So another source that we have especially for Yemen is the waqf. The waqf are charitable endowments. So you given to theoretically for perpetuity. So you give a land and you mention the beneficiaries. So the benefit and the revenues of the land you give for charitable donation will go to the beneficiaries, and this is a legal and administrative source. And we do have, in terms of for Yemen, a lot of awqaf, especially related to the state. So it has been edited. The Waqf al-Hassaniya has been edited by Mohammed Jazim, but we also have unpublished and unexplored to date completely waqf of specific regions. And on the right, you can see like a picture of a 20th century copy of a manuscript awqaf of an institution, of a Sufi institution, so the list of lands that they did possess at the time. So, and this source is mentioned also the emirs, the sheikh, which are the chiefs, the local leaders, but also landowners, countries, also like lands that belong to a group, places, villages, cities, and the mention of the descendants of, the awlad, the sons of, the children of the al, of a group. And but it is very remarkable, noteworthy, that the tribe as a qabila, which is what we understood as a tribe, does not appear either in the administrative sources of the state or in the waqf. Please slide, David. Thanks. And one of the other sources we do have are chronographic sources, which mean like that mention mainly tribal authorities and scholarly authorities, which are like annals, like historiographical works, analytic historiographical works. It mentioned also the sheikh, the chiefs, local chiefs, like the sahib of a place, which is like the master of a place, special leaders, people with authority, al-ri'asa. And just to give you an example, you can see that the mention of Al-Khazraji in one of these sources, like that. This is the kind of narrative you find a lot regarding rural space areas, like Sheikh Aqam bin Wahban, master of Beit Hussein, a village in 1350, had multiplied disorders and disobedience. He had committed horrible misdeeds against the merchants of Beit Hussein and other places, and he killed and plundered in the region. And he was established in the village Qaria of Beit Hussein, and eventually was killed by the local emir, like the appointee of the Sultan, who had to intervene with the army. And so this is a kind of narrative, you think, like slide. And this is and one of our last sources was that as a biographical source, as written by judiciary and scholarly authorities that mention a lot of biographies of scholars, of the ayan, like the great people, like the emir, the sultans. Like this is yeah, like, and you do have thousands of these biographical notices. So, and this is kind of a large corpus. It's really started in early 14th century. It is a very cohesive corpus. So you can basically trace families sometimes for 250 years or more, due to this kind of biographical layers of historiographical writing regarding the same families in their villages, written by these scholars that are interested mostly in terms of scholar. But it means that the vocabulary, like Salis, or like a pious man, a Sahib al-Balad, like a master of a country or of land, the scholar, the alim, the faqih, someone who is the legal jurist, these are vocabularies also that are mentioned a lot in relation to rural areas, but are not specifically the same as the ones mentioned in the other sources, these other sources. And at last, you do have some genealogical sources that mention like kind of maps, and slide please, kind of which creates a cartography of the groups that lived in specific areas. So this is, in fact, this is a very rich corpus in some ways. And I just want to say that this corpus has several discrepancies. So first, you do have various representation of local actors with no systematic correlation in the corpus. And so how do you identify this community? How do you trace the evolution of these communities? Is it possible to do some micro-social history? It is quite difficult. It's especially difficult because most of the narrative concerned the Tihama, the region, the area on the Red Sea coast. But most of the documents we have, like the legal documents we have and administrative documents we have, are in fact concerned much more with other areas in Lower Yemen, in the highlands. Please. So this is a bit difficult. Now, what we do see, and here I just want to say an hypothesis in terms of framework, how to understand what's happening at the time in terms of rural communities, that by the 13th century, during the prosperity of the Rashid Sultanate, you do have a huge amount of, you do see new Londoners and new lands that are being cultivated. So, which means that and a more greater integration of the elites in the Dawla, which are also funded and state supported, especially with fiscal exemptions. So what you see is that several families kind of appearing in 13th century, not all, but some of them are kind of new families, accumulate capital that you can trace within family clans. So it's like it goes to sub-land accumulation. So people have some money, they buy a small land, and then you do have land accumulation. Here, slide please. And accumulation, then like a third step, accumulation of symbolic capital and perpetuation of acquired capital. And that's why the scholarly family is so important, because they show that there is a vast stability of scholarly families. And so this is an example of narrative like Ismail bin Ujay. He's a son of a great scholarly family. He multiplied cultivation. His dira multiplied. He had increasingly more farms in each wadi of Yemen, in each valley of Yemen. And so you can kind of trace this kind of accumulation of capital. Like slide, please. And what happens that in the 14th century, when trouble starts rising in the Rasulid Sultanate, increasingly you do find new groups that emerge. So you find new tribes, new village clans that were not mentioned as such before. So you have, and these villages they are tied to tribes. So you have in the village of Qurashia, and suddenly in early mid-14th century you have the Qurashiyun, and that's a tribe, and they have weapons, and they are like fighting other tribes and the sultans and sultanic authorities. You have the Qaria, and suddenly you have the Qara, which is also a so-called tribal group. So, and what you see is an increasing conflictuality with several families, scholarly families being used as mediators, and so you do have also new villages that are created around specific scholarly families that act as mediating within this group, among these groups of tribal groups, but also with sultanic authorities, and so with and increasingly village clans appear at the forefront of the narratives. So slide please. And I just want to say that by the time in 15th century, by the time the Rasulid Sultanate is kind of progressively collapsing, you find so many new countries like Bilad that appears, like for example the Bilad Banu Hafiz, Bilad Bajila, Bilad Zaranik or Jahafil. These are specific section of lands that seem to have become by the time independent and specifically controlled by important family. For example, the Banu Hafiz, they are a family within the tribe of the Zaydiyun, and this is new. This is a new phenomenon. So there are mention of these groups before, but by this time, they tend to control and apparently raise taxes themselves on the land. So, slide, please. And so I'm just going to give a very short example about the Zaranik. So the Zaranik, or sub-branch of the Maziba, and the Zaranik, they are in Tiama, and they appear in the 14th century in relation to conflicts with the Sultan. And they appear very frequently up until the mid 15th century. And they are, and one of the main issue of the Ma'aziba, slide please. They appear in this area initially. Slide again. And by the mid 15th century, they are also in control of the other area south of the first one. Slide please. And you can see that you can trace their core, the seat of their the seat of the tribes, the main seats at least, and like kind of other sites around Beit al-Faqih with scholarly families that act as mediators of this tribe, but are also part of this tribe. And what you see, slide please, is that in fact the Maziba, basically one of the main issue of violence that is related to them is the land control, is the land grab of palm groves, growing dates of the other tribes that are state funded and state supported, and that support the sultanic authorities. And we know that many of these leaders of this other tribe, which is called the Ashair, are supported by sultanic authorities. And by the 15th century, after many revolts, like perhaps 20 mentioned over the course of 1 century, eventually the Maziba win when the Sultan collapsed. Sultanic authority collapse, and they grab the land of this tribe. So it raises a lot of questions. And after the fall of the Rasulid, when there is this new pale, kind of weaker states that emerge, they kind of we do have this mention of the inventory of the palm groves of the Maghrebi at the main seat, the Maghrebi, and you can see that 100,000 palm trees are subjected to the land tax. 15,000 belong to one of these scholarly families that is part of the Maghrebi, 15,000, and 4,000 is for the rest of like the poor, like the Sufi that are engaged in Sufi activities, in religious practices, in practices of division. And this is this kind of issue when you see that first they've taken land, they've taken palm groves, but kind of 1/5 of these lands belong also to this kind of family scholarly families that mediate between tribes, between village communities, and with the power. And of course, it raises a lot of questions like the status of property, what is the leadership exactly of the organization, what is how the community is organized, and slide. And I guess I'm sorry, slide again. And I guess that. Yeah, please slide. And I guess that this whole process shows that, in fact, you have a progressive change in the community with all these new groups appearing in the 14th century that are supported initially by progressively, increasingly fledgling sultanic power, which means to a reconfiguration of land ownership through violence and land grabs. So because at the heart of this conflictuality in 14th century and 15th century, this is about land and mostly the land tax and the problems with the land tax due to increased fiscal pressure, which led to increasing traces of occasional or institutionalized predation. And that's why by the 15th century, in fact, the entire areas of the Yemeni sultanates are ruined. Most of the cities are gone, as they're just destroyed. And you have had a complete reconfiguration of the rural areas by the mid-15th century, many of which still now are, I mean, many of today's city in Yemen grew up during this kind of 15th century after the fall of the Rasulid Sultanate. And you can see also that some family play important role in the redistribution of resource, which is called the karama, due to in terms of crisis, which also participates in explaining the role of some of these tribal scholarly families that are very prominent in the text and also in the sources. So slide, please. And what I want to say is that in fine, what you do have is that a reconfiguration of rural areas during this 2nd century, with the state increasingly withdrawing, with the plague, with the dynastic wars, the tribal revolts. So everything has changed as entirely. And this new reconfiguration is going to lead to kind of addressing the new spaces of this new reality that seems to emerge, and this is what I hope I'm going to explore. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zahari, for introducing us also to the rural history of late medieval Yemen and demonstrating on the one hand how things look very different in these contexts of conflict and epidemics also, and now you have sort of the state which is withdrawing in a context from rural areas or losing access and power, which is quite opposite from what we saw with Davide's paper in Siena, but also many parallels there in terms of process of integration, disintegration, the rise of new elites, or at least new conflicts between new groups that all focus very much on the competition to land and access to land, but also the rise of all kinds of new hierarchies in these contexts that we also heard Davide talking about. Before opening the floor to the wider audience, my first question to both of you, since we're here within the context of a seminar series that's very much oriented towards the Mediterranean, to what extent it is useful for your case studies, or to what extent the Mediterranean dimension adds anything to your case studies and the analysis and interpretations that you can make. Davide already referred a bit to it, and I guess for southern Tuscany, the Mediterranean is very evident, but I mean, is it the northern and and Western Mediterranean only, or is it also helpful to look beyond towards the south and the east as well? And for Zachary, of course, the Mediterranean is more remote. I guess the Indian Ocean context is more directly relevant, but still there's a lot of research, as you already also referred to, happening on the eastern and the southern Mediterranean, the Maghreb and the Middle East, by colleagues like Yossef Rapoport and Élise Voguet. Does that also connect, or is Yemen related to that? And does the Mediterranean dimension help you to see things that you otherwise would not be able to? So an open question to both of you.
I can try to briefly answer first. Well, thank you very much for this question, again, for inviting me to this seminar. It's not a case that I accepted because I'm really interested in the Mediterranean perspective, as I have a chance also to explore more just a few months ago when I was preparing a co-author paper chapter for the handbook of Mediterranean history about agriculture in the Mediterranean. What I'm seeing more and more is that indeed focusing on, let's say, central northern Italy, the main comparison is towards Europe and then toward the northern and western rims of the Mediterranean. But more and more, I think, if we take as an example the impact of the Black Death, of the subsequent epidemics, it's really relevant to assess this impact and to compare throughout the Mediterranean. So by looking, for instance, at what happened in Egypt, for instance, but also in other cases. So I think this case, as well as, for instance, the development of pastoralism, of transhumance, has also a Mediterranean perspective. So I think there is a space for the comparison, even for my own perspective, in order to enrich my analysis.
Yeah.
Zachary, sorry, just need, if you have very briefly, and then
Yes.
unfortunately we already need to wrap up for the broadcasted part of this talk, but then we can continue afterwards.
Thanks. For me, it seems fundamental to engage with especially Mediterranean history when it comes to rural areas, because as I mentioned, like the field in the Western areas, and I guess Byzantine too, is so much more advanced that, and that behind the background, that's a religious background of Islam, or like the specific status of the communities that we mentioned, and the sources themselves, they are like this kind of basic, very deep reality of the people at the time, and when we talk about conflictuality for peasantry, we talk about conflictuality for peasantry everywhere. And so there is this is the same phenomenon that basically we are studying. And I think from the perspective of Islam, we can learn a lot. I mean, just what you just presented, it gives ideas in terms of transhumance, in terms of how, Siena manage its own strategy of development regarding these communities. This is very interesting, even if the framework is not the same. So I think it's fundamental indeed.
Thank you very much, Zach.
Thank you, Yo, and thank you to our panelists today, Davide and Zachary, for their fantastic paper. And thank you to everyone who's been attending this session. And just a reminder that our next webinar will be on Monday, the 10th of February. So a little bit of a change in terms of date, not our usual Tuesday, but information will be shared soon. And the next one will be about central and peripheral authority in the medieval Mediterranean, with Damien Smith, Philippa Barn, and Natalie Webstale as speakers. So we look forward to seeing you there. And thank you again for attending. And again, a massive thank you to our speaker and our chair for today. Bye-bye.